In the late 1920s, a pilot crossing the deserts of southern Peru looked down and saw something that should not exist. Perfectly straight lines running for miles across the dead earth, and among them, drawings. A monkey, a whale, a hummingbird the size of a stadium. Figures so enormous they can only be seen from the sky, carved by a people who could never fly, more than 2,000 years ago. For a century, the questions only multiplied. Why do some lines aim at the setting sun? Why did one woman spend 40 years sweeping this desert by hand? And why did it take a fleet of drones to finally reveal the truth? Because the mystery has been solved. And we have the proof. To understand the mystery, you first have to understand the canvas. The Nazca Desert is one of the driest places on planet Earth. Rain here is not a season, it is an event. The region receives around 20 minutes of rainfall per year, not 20 minutes per week or per month, 20 minutes in an entire year. Almost nothing grows, almost nothing moves. And that lifeless stillness is precisely what makes this place extraordinary. Because the Nazca Desert is not just a wasteland, it is a preservation vault. There is no rain to wash the ground away, and a layer of warm air hovering over the plateau shields the surface from the wind. Whatever is written on this desert floor stays written, not for decades, but for millennia. The people of the Nazca culture understood their canvas perfectly. Their technique was almost absurdly simple. The desert surface is covered in a thin skin of reddish-brown pebbles, darkened by centuries of sun. But directly beneath that skin lies soil of a completely different color, a pale yellowish gray. Remove the top layer and you expose a bright line against a dark background. No paint, no carving into stone, just subtraction. The Nazca people scraped away the dark surface the way an artist scratches ink from a board, and the desert itself did the rest, holding those lines in place for more than 2,000 years. But the simplicity of the method makes the scale of the work even harder to comprehend. Some of the figures are modest, 10 to 20 feet across. Others defy belief. The largest geoglyphs stretch 1,200 feet, the height of the Empire State Building laid flat on the ground. Straight lines run dead level for miles, crossing hills and gullies without bending. And here's the detail that changes everything. The evidence shows the Nazca did not improvise these images. They appear to have started with small-scale models, working out each design in miniature, then scaling the proportions up with remarkable precision. Think about what that requires for a moment. Mathematics, measurement, planning, the coordination of many hands working on a figure so large that no single one of them would ever see it whole. Whoever made these lines knew exactly what they were doing, and they did it on purpose, again and again, hundreds of times. Now, most people assume the lines were discovered in the 1920s when aircraft first crossed this desert, but that is not quite true. The very first written record is far older. In the 16th century, a Spanish chronicler traveling through Peru described the lines in a document known as the Chronicle of Peru, and he described them in the plainest possible way, as trail markers in the desert. Not temples, not wonders. Markers for people finding their way. Hold on to that phrase, because it will matter more than anyone realized for the next 400 years. At the time, nobody cared. From the ground, the lines look like nothing, faint scratches wandering off toward the horizon. Their true shapes are invisible unless you rise hundreds of feet above them. So the lines waited. They waited through the Spanish Empire, through revolutions, through the entire modern age, until humanity finally built machines that could fly. In the 1930s, commercial planes began crossing southern Peru, and passengers pressed their faces to the windows and saw a monkey the size of a village staring back at them. The world was electrified. Scientists came with instruments and theories, and the first researcher who stood in this desert and truly studied the lines reached a conclusion that would dominate the mystery for decades. He believed he was standing inside a book written in the stars. The man's name was Paul Kosok, an American professor who arrived in Peru in the 1940s. He had not come for the lines at all. He was studying ancient irrigation systems, the channels and canals of long-dead civilizations, but the desert had other plans for him. One evening, Kosok was standing at the end of one of the long straight lines, watching the sun sink toward the horizon. The date was one day after the winter solstice, and as the sun touched the earth, he realized something that made his breath catch. The line he was standing on pointed directly at the setting sun, not roughly, not approximately, directly. Out of all the directions a line could possibly run, this one aimed at the exact spot where the sun died on one of the most significant days of the ancient calendar. For a scientist, a moment like that feels like the universe whispering in your ear. Kosok did the math, considered the odds, and reached a conclusion that would echo through the next half-century of research. The Nazca lines, he declared, were the largest astronomy book in the world, a calendar the size of a desert. Lines marking solstices and equinoxes, a civilization's knowledge of the heavens, written on the ground in strokes miles long. It was a beautiful theory. It felt right. And it was about to gain its greatest champion. Her name was Maria Reiche, a German mathematician who came to the desert as Kosok's assistant and never truly left. What began as a research post became a life's obsession. Reiche measured the lines, mapped them, and calculated their bearings against the movements of the sun, the moon, and the stars. She became convinced the desert was an enormous observatory, and she devoted herself to it with a dedication that borders on the unbelievable. She spent 40 years of her life among the lines. She swept them by hand, inch by inch, clearing away wind-blown debris with an ordinary broom so the figures would stay visible, walking miles of desert alone under the punishing sun. When she learned that trucks and careless visitors were driving across the geoglyphs, she moved into a small house at the edge of the desert to stand guard over them herself. Locals began calling her the Lady of the Lines. And here is something worth pausing on. Whatever the lines turned out to be, the fact that we can study them at all is partly because one woman decided they were worth protecting when almost nobody else on Earth cared. Reiche championed the calendar theory for the rest of her life. In her vision, the great figures traced constellations, and the lines tracked the turning of the seasons, telling farmers when to plant and when to harvest. The idea captured the world's imagination. It appeared in books, documentaries, and classrooms. For decades, if you asked anyone what the Nazca lines were, you received the same confident answer: an ancient calendar, a map of the sky. But confidence is not proof. And in science, every beautiful theory eventually faces the same cold question: does the evidence actually support it? In the 1970s, a new generation of researchers arrived in the desert, armed with computers, statistics, and a willingness to test what everyone else had simply accepted. They took the astronomy theory, the elegant idea that had ruled the mystery for 30 years, and they did something nobody had properly done before. They checked it, line by line, bearing by bearing, against the actual sky, and what they found did not strengthen the astronomy book. It tore the pages out, one by one, until almost nothing was left. The problem with the astronomy theory was hiding in plain sight, and it was a problem of pure mathematics. The Nazca Desert does not contain a handful of carefully placed lines. It contains hundreds upon hundreds of them, radiating in every direction the compass allows, and that abundance is fatal to the theory. Because if you draw enough lines pointing in enough directions, some of them will inevitably aim at something meaningful. Fire enough arrows at random, and a few will strike the target every single time. When researchers ran the numbers, that is exactly what they found. Yes, some lines pointed at the solstice sun, but no more than chance alone would predict. For every line that matched a celestial event, dozens matched nothing at all. Kosok's sunset had been real. His conclusion had not. The alignment that took his breath away was almost certainly a coincidence, one lucky arrow in a desert full of them. And the astronomy theory had a second, deeper flaw. It could not explain the animals. Think about it for a moment. If the lines are a calendar, a practical instrument for tracking the seasons, then why does the desert also contain a monkey with a spiral tail? Why a whale, a spider, a hummingbird the size of a stadium? A calendar does not need a monkey. An observatory does not need an orca. The theory that ruled the mystery for 30 years simply pretended the most spectacular figures in the desert did not exist. Of course, where serious theories stumble, wild ones rush in. In the 1960s and 70s, popular books began claiming the lines were something else entirely. Landing strips. Runways for visitors from another world, built by people who could never have made such things alone. The idea sold millions of copies. It also collapses the instant you kneel down and touch the desert floor. The lines are not engineered surfaces. They are scratches, mere inches deep, scraped into soft soil and loose gravel. Any heavy machine attempting to land on them would sink and tear the ground apart. The great trapezoids lead nowhere, connect to nothing, and support nothing. And there is a quieter, more human problem with that theory. It assumes the people of Nazca could not have built these figures themselves, when the evidence of their models, their measurements, and their planning proves they absolutely could. The lines are not evidence of visitors. They are evidence of genius. But here's the remarkable thing. The astronomy theory and the runway fantasy, opposites in every other way, shared one hidden assumption. Both took it for granted that the lines were meant to be seen from above, that the audience was in the sky, whether gods, stars, or something stranger. That assumption felt so obvious that for decades, almost nobody thought to question it. And it was wrong. It was the mistake that kept the mystery alive for 400 years. Because the Nazca people never saw their own figures from the air, not once. No tower, no hill, no mountain in the region offers a full view of the great designs. Whatever the lines meant, they had to mean it to people standing on the ground, people walking among them, dwarfed by drawings they could never see whole. The lines were never a message to the sky, they were something else entirely. And the first real clue had been sitting in this story from the very beginning, hiding inside the driest statistic on Earth: 20 minutes of rain per year. Hold that number in your mind. Because the moment you take it seriously, every animal, every line, and every trapezoid in this desert begins to make perfect sense. In Nazca, water is not a resource. It is the boundary between existence and extinction. 20 minutes of rain per year means no rivers you can trust, no seasons you can count on, no margin for error, ever. Every family, every harvest, every generation lived or died by water that had to come from somewhere else, trickling down from the distant Andes through channels and underground aquifers. When your entire world hangs by that single thread, water is not just something you drink, it is something you worship. In the 1970s, researchers finally took that fact seriously. They looked at the great straight lines and trapezoids and asked a new question. Not what do they point at in the sky, but what do they mean on the ground, in the driest place on Earth? And the answer they proposed changed the direction of the entire mystery. The lines, they argued, were connected to water. They pointed toward places of ritual, locations where the people of Nazca gathered in ceremony, pleading with their gods for rain and fertile fields. The desert floor was not an observatory, it was a sacred stage. And then came the moment the animals finally spoke. For decades, the menagerie of the desert had been the great unanswered question, the monkey, the spider, the hummingbird, that no calendar could explain. But in the cultures of the Andes, those animals were never random. They were a vocabulary. The spider was a sign of rain. The hummingbird stood for fertility. And the monkey, a creature that does not live in the desert at all, but in the Amazon on the far side of the mountains, symbolized abundance of water, the lush, dripping world where water never runs out. Read them together, and the message is unmistakable. Every figure in the desert is a word, and every word means water. The Nazca were not drawing their zoo. They were writing their prayers. Suddenly, the pieces begin locking into place. The trapezoids and lines guide people toward ritual grounds. The animal figures speak the language of rain and fertility. The whole desert becomes a single sacred landscape, built by a people begging the sky not for meaning, but for survival. And now, remember the clue from the very beginning of this story. The 16th century chronicle of Peru, the oldest written record of the lines, described them in the plainest possible words: trail markers in the desert. For 400 years, that description was dismissed as the ignorance of a passing traveler who did not understand what he was looking at. But he understood perfectly. He had simply asked the local people, and they had told him the truth. The lines were paths, markers, routes meant for human feet. The answer had been written down within living memory of the Nazca world, and science spent 4 centuries ignoring it. Because here is the reframe that solves the oldest riddle of all, the question of why a people who could not fly would draw figures they could never see. They did not need to see them. The lines were not made to be looked at. They were made to be walked. Processions moving along the body of a hummingbird, ceremonies flowing through the legs of a spider, entire communities tracing sacred images step by step, becoming part of the drawing itself. The audience was never in the sky. The audience was the walker. It was a beautiful theory, and it explained almost everything. But a theory, no matter how elegant, is not proof. Proof required something impossible, seeing every line in the desert at once. And that would take machines the Nazca could never have imagined. The machines arrived from the other side of the Pacific. For years, a team of archaeologists from Yamagata University in Japan has been running one of the most ambitious mapping campaigns in the history of archaeology. Their tools are high-resolution aerial photography and fleets of drones flying low and slow over the desert, photographing every meter of ground in detail no tourist plane ever could. Their goal sounds simple. Do not study the famous figures. Find all of them. Because here is the uncomfortable truth the drones exposed. After a century of research, humanity had never actually seen the Nazca lines. Not completely. We had seen the giants, the monkey, the hummingbird, the whale, the figures large enough to catch a passenger's eye from a window seat. But the desert was hiding an entire second population of drawings, and they were invisible for the most human reason imaginable. They were small. Many measure only 10 to 20 feet across, human-scale images lost in a wilderness of stone, faded by 2,000 years of sun and dust. From a plane, they are nothing. From a drone, 50 feet up, they snap into focus like ghosts stepping out of the ground. And the numbers are staggering. The Yamagata team has now identified 358 geoglyphs. 168 of them were found in 2022 alone. Read that again. In a single year, one team discovered more figures than the world had cataloged across entire previous decades. The desert's population exploded. Humans, camelids, the llamas and alpacas of the Andes, birds, orca whales, cats, snakes, a gallery of images created between roughly 100 BCE and 300 CE, waiting 20 centuries to be counted. But the count was never the point. The point was the pattern. Because once you can see every figure at once, plotted on a single map, you can finally ask the question that solves the mystery. Where are they? And the answer is the verdict. The figures are not scattered randomly across the desert. The long, linear geoglyphs point the direction from valley to valley, connecting the inhabited pockets of this brutal landscape. The figures drawn on slopes sit deliberately alongside ancient pathways, positioned exactly where travelers moving between settlements would pass them. Think about what this means for a moment. The images cluster along routes. They face the roads. They stand where human feet actually walked, like signs on a highway, like murals along a pilgrim's path. This is not the layout of an observatory gazing at the heavens. This is the layout of a network, built for people moving across the ground. The desert was signposted. The 16th century chronicler called the lines trail markers, and the drones, 400 years later, proved him right, pixel by pixel. And the census is not finished. The Yamagata team has now enlisted artificial intelligence, training it on every known figure until the machine learned the visual language of the Nazca. The AI studies the desert and predicts designs that are likely to exist, faint patterns a human eye would dismiss as noise. Then the researchers travel into the desert and check the ground. Again and again, the figures are actually there. A machine built in the 21st century is finishing a map that the Nazca began drawing 2,000 years ago, and every new discovery lands in the same pattern, along the paths, beside the routes, facing the walkers. The evidence was no longer a theory stitched from fragments. It was a complete picture, drawn from thousands of photographs and hundreds of figures. And with the census in hand, every piece of the century-long puzzle can finally be placed on the table one by one. So let us lay out the evidence, piece by piece, the way a courtroom would. Exhibit 1, the written record. In the 16th century, within reach of living memory of the Nazca world, a Spanish chronicler asked what the lines were and wrote down the answer. Trail markers in the desert. The oldest testimony we possess describes paths, not calendars, not messages to the sky. Exhibit 2, the land itself. This is the driest desert on Earth, a place with 20 minutes of rain per year, where water decided who lived and who did not. Any explanation of the lines that ignores water ignores the single fact that ruled every Nazca life from birth to death. Exhibit 3, the vocabulary. The animals are not decoration. In the cultures of the Andes, the spider signals rain, the hummingbird speaks of fertility, and the monkey, a creature of the drenched Amazon, means abundance of water. Every figure translates, and every translation points to the same desperate hope. Exhibit 4, the census. 358 geoglyphs, mapped by drones, and the map shows order, not chance. The lines run valley to valley. The figures stand beside ancient pathways, facing the routes where people actually walked. Exhibit 5, the network. Taken together, the geoglyphs form a system of communication and movement across a lethal landscape, guiding travelers, marking sacred ground, binding scattered settlements into one world. 5 independent lines of evidence: a chronicle, a climate, a vocabulary, a census, and a network. None of them depends on the others, and every single one points in the same direction. Now, honesty demands a caveat, and it is an important one. The desert holds hundreds of figures, and no one can claim to know the purpose of every single line. Some may have carried meanings we will never recover. It is even possible that a few alignments served the sky as well as the ground, that Kosok's solstice line was one thread among many. Science does not hand out certainty. It hands out verdicts based on the weight of evidence, and the weight here is overwhelming. So here is what actually happened, told as one unbroken chain. 2,000 years ago, a people settled one of the harshest places on this planet, trapped between the ocean and the mountains, in a land where rain almost never falls. Their survival hung on water they could not control, trickling down from peaks they could barely see. So they turned their desert into an instrument. They scraped away the dark stones to draw pale lines, and the lines became pathways, processional routes where entire communities walked in ceremony step by step through the bodies of sacred images. They drew the spider, the hummingbird, the monkey, writing their prayers for rain and fertility in a vocabulary every person understood. They stretched straight lines from valley to valley, marking the ways across the wasteland, placing figures where travelers would pass, so that no one moving through that emptiness was ever truly lost or ever far from the gods. Not an astronomy book, not a runway, a landscape-sized prayer for water, and a map for the living. And now the impossible facts from the beginning of this story have all been paid in full. The line that aimed at the setting sun, one arrow among hundreds, striking its target by chance. The woman who swept the desert for 40 years, guarding a masterpiece the world had not yet understood. And the fleet of drones, counting figure after figure along the ancient paths until the pattern could no longer be denied. The mystery of the Nazca lines is not a mystery anymore. It is a story, their story. The solution does not shrink the Nazca lines, it makes them greater. We wanted them to be messages to the heavens, written for gods or visitors from the stars. The truth is more human and more moving. A civilization facing annihilation by drought answered with 2,000 years of art, engineering, and faith. They mastered geometry without writing, organized thousands of hands, and built something so vast it outlived their entire culture, all to ask for rain. The people of Nazca are gone, but their prayer is still written on the earth, waiting when their descendants finally learn to fly. We spent a century asking who the lines were for. They were for the people walking them. Like and subscribe. See you in the next exploration.